Thank you very much. I'm Jens de Get, the journalist who will moderate this session, and I can already promise you that your understanding of life and biodiversity will change radically during the next hour if you stay here. I would also say that we have two of the most influential researchers within this field in the world present here, and just speaking to them outside made me completely high before we came in here. So it's a really interesting topic and really interesting people. I will start asking you, Kathy, so why is biodiversity important?
Well, it's an interesting, so in 2010, it was the International Year of Biodiversity, and I just want to start with a story, actually. So International Year of Biodiversity, and the BBC thought, great, we'll interview people in the UK and ask them what they think the term biodiversity means. And 80% of the interviewees thought it was a washing powder. And to me, that's the first part of, so biodiversity, of course, is the diversity of all biological organisms on life on Earth, from genes through to populations, communities. But I think I realized at that point there was going to need to be a really big shift in understanding of biodiversity. Why is it important, though? And I'm also based at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, so I'm primarily a plant scientist. So Carsten and I will talk plants and animals this evening. Why is it important? Well, just breathe in. That air you are breathing has been regulated by plants. Look at what you're wearing. Everything you're wearing has come from a plant, or almost all. I can see some plastic and some rubber. Oh, rubber from a plant. Think about what you've eaten today. Think about your clean water that we've all got in our water bottles. All of that has been regulated in some way or produced in some way by biodiversity. That's why it's important. It underpins all life on Earth.
And you, Kathy, you are more in the plant world,
yeah,
where you are working with plants, but Carsten, you are in the animal world. Why are the animals important for us?
The other things that governs most of life on Earth is animals, so plants and animals goes together. I'm an ornithologist, but I won't talk a lot about how important birds are because they're not that important. What is basically together with plants ruling the world is bugs, tiny organisms, especially in soil. So a lot of the regulating mechanisms that enable us to plant and have successful growth, to have water regulations, is governed by communities and assemblages of tiny insects and bugs. They comprise about 80 to 90% of all life on Earth, and they are enormously important for our function of the life-supporting system that Earth is for humans.
But again, when we talk about biodiversity, why it is important for us that there might be less species of spiders in Borneo? It doesn't seem to bother us very much because we don't even know which spiders there are.
Well, what we do know is that if we go out in different types of ecosystems, they function, they do things. They produce, for example, they're cleaning up water, they are circulating nutrients. They're doing that as an ecosystem, but the components of the ecosystems are the species in them in interaction with abiotic factors like weather and climate. So it's a community of it. I was once asked by the Dutch EU commissioner that understood that biodiversity was important for all of these things, and he basically said, I understand that, but if we look at pollinations, that is done by insects, and especially bees and bumblebees, he said we have 10 bumblebees in Holland. Do we need them all? And which one can we lose? And my answer was, we don't know, but we know if we start losing them, that it will change the system, and that's the problem. This is why we care about biodiversity as a whole.
So what does it mean for also the ecological system resilience? How much does the biodiversity mean for the stability of ecological systems?
So we know that on Earth we have impacted and changed about 50% of the ecosystems. Some of those changes has been major, some of them has been minor. But what we don't know is exactly how ecosystem works. So we can go out and study how a natural system works, and we can also study that when we start tampering around with it and changing it, that they change. So when we talk about the services or goods that the ecosystem provides, then there's different arguments. There is research that indicates that natural systems are more resilient to changes. There are research that indicates that when you have a catastrophe, they bounce back quicker. There's also research that indicates that what they produce are more predictable. And if we're looking at the services bouncing back, being resilient, and being more predictable, is a really good thing for humans also.
But I also wonder, we already announced that with this presentation here that there is a huge problem of mass extinction. How bad is it? How bad is this mass extinction? How much effect does it have, and how fast is it going?
Well, if you look at the mass extinctions in the fossil records, you can see that the amount of change that we're seeing is actually much higher than we've seen in previous intervals. So that is very, very serious. And it's going at a much, much faster rate as far as we can tell as well. So therefore, the whole thing is going much more quickly, and we're losing more species. But there is a sort of a chink of good news in there, I think, for plants. I'm going to keep going for plants here. So if you look at the fossil record, in fact, what you find is you never see mass extinction in plants. You see the mass extinctions that we all know of dinosaurs and all the huge changes, but you don't see it in plants. So why is that? Well, I always give this example. If you go into a zoo and you hammer all the animals on the head, you won't be very popular, but you also won't have a zoo left. If you go into a botanic garden and cut all those plants down or burn them, in 10 years' time, those plants will be back. Because plants have incredibly resilient mechanisms. So they have seeds that can be in the soil seed bank. They can sprout out from roots. They can change from being a sexual to an asexual reproduction mode. And therefore, they have, through time, been more resilient. And I hope, going forwards, that we won't see such a huge impact on the plant record than we do on the animals.
But Carsten, researchers are talking about a new global catastrophe at the scale as last time the dinosaurs were extinct. And why don't we see this? What are the signs?
So, to put it in perspective, the Earth is a billion of years old. We've had 5 periods of mass extinctions, and mass extinction is basically losing between 50 and 90% of the animals. So we have seen that 5 times before. They've been caused by climate change and other things. The last one was 65 million years ago, where an asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and we also had eruption of undersea volcanoes that basically caused all the dinosaurs to go extinct. Actually, they didn't go all of them. The small ones survived. They're here around today and is flying around. They are birds. But basically everything that was larger than a breadbasket of animals disappeared in the air pollution. That happened 65 million years ago. When we talk about the 6th period of mass extinction, that is the period we're living in today. That is because when we're looking at animals, especially vertebrates, birds and mammals, we can see that we start losing them at a rate that is 1,000 to 10,000 larger than the background rate. And the background rate for these animals are around 1 to 2 species per million year. So it's happened about 1,000 to 10,000 faster today. And if you look at the Earth and we classify species, for those species we have information about, Of the animals, about 20% of all organisms on Earth is classified as threatened. So if we continue the route we're going, they are in risk of going extinct. Yeah. And this is why we talk about a mass extinction and a biodiversity crisis. And what is really unique about it is that it's caused by another species, and that's us.
And that's very different to previous times.
Only one species. But again, don't we have evolution? Don't we have new species coming up?
Well, we do, yes. So on average, certainly in plants, we identify around 2,000 new species a year. So there's a huge amount of diversity out there we still don't know about. And we are seeing evolutionary change occurring in the current plant kingdom. Yeah.
But evolution takes time.
It takes a lot of time.
And it takes lots of time. So basically, with the natural background rate of 1 to 2 species per million, we have a buildup of diversity on Earth. But this rate with about 1,000 to 10,000 is so quick that if you are just predicting it into the future, we stand to lose maybe 10, 20, 30% within 50 to 100 years. I don't believe those figures. I actually think they're too hard because even animals are damn hard to kill. So we often have a lot of small population that is hanging on, but what we can see is that we are losing life. So if we take birds, which is my favorite group, we have 10,000 species of birds, and then we have some birds like chicken and turkey that we are producing. So today, the biomass of the number of individuals is 70% of birds we breed and butcher, whereas the rest is shrinked to 30%. If we go into animals, cow productions and pigs and all that, they now constitute 80%. Yeah. So it's a very few species that constitute the most thing, and this is why we're losing diversity, and this is the biodiversity loss we're talking about. So it's not just the number of species, it's basically the loss of the variation of life and the amount of life.
Yeah.
And that will affect us humans before we know it.
This is where the crises come in, and this is again where we in research are looking a lot at what is the consequences of this. And if we some of the things that Kathy started by saying, and some of the add-ons with the bugs and the ecosystem functions, they do provide airs and clean water and neutral circulations. And economists have tried to make some estimates of what that is worth. And the estimate is staggering. They're very uncertain, but the estimate is that up to 50% of the global gross national product that humans are consuming are coming from nature. So if we are losing that function, that could be important for humans.
No, but I'm also, sorry, I have to use my microphone now. No, I'm just wondering what does it mean in this country, in Denmark, because we are not used to talk about biodiversity as a problem.
So I know that most Danes think Denmark is great. We are very, very tiny. I sometimes say that when I'm getting asked what does it mean for Danes, I would say that we could path Denmark completely and turn it into a parking lot, and it probably wouldn't change the earth, but I wouldn't like to live here.
Okay.
Yeah, what do the Brits say to the same thing?
Well, yes, it's quite interesting. If you flooded the whole of the UK, you'd lose 3 endemic plant species. But it's much more than that. It's also the cultural services. It's all the well-being that you get from being surrounded by biodiversity. Biodiversity, whatever it is important everywhere. I think the humans have such a close relationship to their environment, and we sometimes lose sight of that at our peril, I would say.
But I was just curious about if we are taking it serious enough, what could we do in order to change this mass extinction?
Do you want to do that? Do you want to?
I mean, the threat against biodiversity is the loss of places to live. If a species have no place to live, it is in trouble. So we are losing a lot of wild nature and wild habitat. This is why one of the major instruments is to manage nature. So we have national park, those are protections, but most of them is going into that we need to manage it so we're not losing it. This is also what we're debating in Denmark with untouched forest. So Denmark, for example, in Europe, we have a scheme called the Area 2000, and it's all over the news today that we are planning on reducing that in Denmark right now. In Europe, we have 18% is set aside that we need to take care of nature in those areas. Denmark is just below Britain at the very, very bottom in Europe at about 8%. And right now in Denmark, we're discussing about how about we make some less areas for nature. That's not the way forward.
So there's two other ways. So there's the areas for nature, and they can be in Denmark, they can be in the UK, and most countries have signed up to 15%. So Denmark and the UK are way down. But another way is ex situ conservation, which means effectively you are taking those things that are really important and conserving them elsewhere, and then able to put them back once the situation is better or the drivers that are causing the change have occurred. So let me give you an example, and that is a seed bank. I don't know how many of you have heard about the Svalbard seed bank, where basically our crops are all stored in a huge vault in Svalbard, and these are basically, if the crops get diseased, our present day, we have a backup plan. Now in Kew, in the UK, we have the Millennium Seed Bank. We have 38,000 species and 2 billion seeds stored in a vault. And the aim there is to have 50% of the world's plants stored as seeds. Now it's a living seed bank. So those seeds, we have to keep, every 5 years, we have to keep regerminating them. It's a huge, huge task. But those seeds are our future. Even if we have a nuclear war, it means we do have those genes to replant, to put back out into the world. And most recently, one way we've used those seeds is with the terrible hurricanes that happened in the Dominican Republic. We're now going out there and helping them to restore their plants from the seeds in the seed bank. And I think so that's another way of conserving, which I think is a way that everybody can join in with. You can sponsor seeds, you can start to understand that there are ways around mass extinction, the thought of it is so terrifying that we have to be working really hard to find ways to deal with this.
And this is where I envy botanists, because they can do this. If we look at animals, this is actually my very first scientific paper ever, was a global analysis of how do captive breeding programs do for animals.
Yeah.
And they have a 99.9% failure rate.
This is breeding in zoos, is it?
And yes,
yeah.
and they're really, really terrible at it. So we can't do what botanists does. So we are stuck with problems, and we are especially stuck with problems for large animals, but also for a lot of the bugs. And one of the reasons for that might be because we simply do not know how what they depend upon, and we can't breed them successfully. We can do it in zoos and other places. As soon as we release them out, they tend to die. They don't function, they don't get into the systems. There's a much more higher success rate for that in plants. The other reason why I envy a botanist is basically I'm an ornithologist. I have to get up 4 o'clock in the morning when I work with birds. The botanists sleep long in the camps and go out, and the plants are still there.
But the problem with being a botanist is that people are not so interested in plants because they don't have big eyes, they don't have beautiful feathers. Yeah. And a really old family friend of mine, she's 88, and she said she only became interested in plants when she retired, because she suddenly realized if you looked at a plant, it didn't run away from you. And immediately I thought, okay, I understand now. And it's trying to get people to understand, even these plants that are very unattractive, small, weedy plants, play an incredibly important role in all life on Earth.
But Kathy, I'm thinking about, it's also a real problem if you have only very few species in the plant world. For example, this picture is a desert
Grapeseed, yes.
from a plant point of view, but also if you only have one type
Yeah.
of a species, then you can easily get infections or diseases.
So we eat, 80% of our food comes from 10 crops. And our coffee comes from 2 crops, coffee Arabica and coffee Robusta. And so when you go to Starbucks, or I don't know do you have Starbucks in Denmark? Lots
Yes,
of them,
yes.
no doubt. The world has Starbucks. When you go there and they say you're having Guatemalan coffee, you're still having the same species, it's just been grown in Guatemala. And the problem with that, of course, is one disease, or 1 or 2 diseases, can wipe the whole crop out. And you don't have to go far back in history, certainly in the UK, to think about the Irish potato famine. It was a result because total reliance on these very, very narrow selection of crops. And so this is why biodiversity is also really important, because what we need to be looking for are the relatives of those crops, so the crop wild relatives, and make sure that we conserve those because they contain the resilient genes that you can then breed back into your crops. But we were talking about this earlier. The problem with crop wild relatives is that they haven't been bred for the big, juicy fruit. And if you look at the crop wild relative of the banana, for example, the bananas are this big, and they have a black seed in them like this. And it's such a tough seed that if you bite into it, it will break your tooth. So of course, people are not, you see that and you think, well, that's no good. I'll go for the nice one. And the problem with this underpins the big problem that we don't tend to want to conserve things that are not very attractive, they don't taste very nice, they don't have big blossomy flowers. And yet those are the things we should really, really be focusing on to stop the problem that will happen with this when you get one disease wiping out the whole lot. Because that threat to global food security is very, very real. And you only have to look at the way that pathogens are spreading across from the south to the north right now, both in animals and plants, to realize this is a very, very serious problem.
No, I can also say that as a special bonus to this debate, we have the music added to it, so we can both listen and have the music. But
on the coffee things, because I think that's a good example. Danes drinks a lot of coffee, so we're interested in coffee, but also shows that in addition to what Kathy just illustrated, why biodiversity is important. So if coffee do not need to be pollinated, but if they are pollinated, they have a 10% larger yield. So we actually get a 10% larger yield if they are pollinated. But we also know, so what a lot of coffee planters has done is that they're putting out honeybees and they're pollinated. But the problem with the monocultures of honeybees is that they too are subject for diseases and pathogens. But what we also have learned is that if there are more than one pollinators, if there is 10 different pollinators, which could be wild bees, the yield goes up to 20%. And if you start calculating the value of this on Earth, then these wild bugs, these wild bees are enormously important. And this is why a lot of coffee plantation around the world is actually starting to be interested in biodiversity around it, because it makes good sense.
So
there's another example of that with the coffee, actually, which just came out recently, where when you think about it, the coffee plants need to have shade. And so what the planters have been doing is using an exotic plant as shade. But when they compared the exotic plant to the native biodiversity, what they found was that the native biodiversity had less impact on the coffee. So these exotic plants used more water, more soil, and were basically starving the coffee plants of the nutrients. So again, it's the local biodiversity that really does know best in those situations.
But I'm just wondering, how bad is the situation with the bees? How much is the numbers going down, and how many bees are we losing?
I don't know exact numbers. They are declining. If we start by saying how important are they, they're about 7 to 9% of our agricultural production depends on pollination. And if you start doing the figures of this is billions and billions and billions of dollars. We have tried to replace it by honeybees, but we have had a collapse in honeybees for different reasons. There's the diseases, but we also have used pesticides, and they're going into the honeybees. The other problems with the honeybees is that they are in competition with the local bees, the natural bees. So this is a big issue right now. Are there bees enough in this world to pollinate agriculture? Yes, I think so. So we're not there where things are starting to collapse, but it's a very, very dangerous system to build up a very simplified monoculture with an agriculture that needs pollination, and then have one species that pollinates. That's a high risk to take. So if you're an economist and you start calculating, is that risk worth taking?
Yeah.
Then it's not. And then it's very cheap to remove that risk by having diversity out there.
And in South America, it's not bees, but birds.
It is mostly bees.
Is it still both
bees and birds, yes.
Yeah. So I heard also that the Danes are not that good at coping with the international rules and regulation on biodiversity. We are actually, in order to live up to the rules, really trying to cut the corners.
On a global scale, to deal with these issues, we have agreed, 126 countries has agreed to establish nature in 70% of the terrestrial world and 70% in the marine world. Denmark is very, very low on this. And I don't know if this is a reason, but if we look at the reporting in of protected areas from Denmark to the United Nations, we have reported in all the sanctuaries and all the preservation of graveyards and churches. They make very little sense for this, and I don't know if we're dressing up our figures on purpose or whether a poor guy mistook these things, but this is what we're doing right now. And as I said before, the set-aside areas in the European context, we are lowest in Europe, and we're now talking about taking more out. So we're not, really doing what it needs to take in order to have a diverse and secure nature in Denmark. There's another angle to why we need in Denmark to take care of this, because we talk about the importance at the global scale. I returned from a COP meeting in Colombia debating this, and there's one message from all the other countries, especially third world countries that has a lot of biodiversity. We're putting a lot of pressure on them to preserve biodiversity there, but they're basically saying, we are willing to do that if you also take care of nature back home. So they're not willing to take on all the burden of doing. They want the Western world and the rich world also to step up and show the way forward. And this is about stewardship for biodiversity.
So what about UK? Are you one of the leading countries in the world, or are you also trying to get over it as cheap as possible?
I mean, we lead on certain parts, and we're very good at telling other people what to do. But we're not very good at doing it ourselves, I think would be the honest answer for the UK. So we do lead on a number of the things like the IUCN red listing and all these other things where we're out there telling people what they should do with their protected areas. But I think there's, about 3 years ago I went to Madagascar, and we have a big research centre out there, and I was really excited. I'd watched many films about Madagascar, and even the cartoon. My children watched the cartoon. I thought, it's fantastic. We'll see dancing lemurs. And I got off the plane, and the first thing I could smell was burning. And Madagascar as a country has been burning for 10 years. And the biodiversity, the rate of loss is massive. Now, we keep saying, you must protect biodiversity. But I don't know if anyone in this room has been to Madagascar. But the level of poverty there, it's one of the countries in the world where poverty is getting worse, not better. And you see abject poverty, people with 5 or 6 children, and the only way they can make an income is to sell charcoal. And so they burn the trees to make charcoal. And I think the two are very closely related, because it's not so much about actually, the biodiversity we have in the UK, which is not a lot, we discussed before, but also properly paying for the biodiversity and the services it provides in those most biodiverse areas in the world. And I think that's where we have to really change that dialogue if we want to conserve biodiversity, because the best biodiversity, or the most important biodiversity, are in parts of the world that are completely stricken with poverty. And it is their only resource. And therefore we have to also think about, can we put a value on that biodiversity? And can we get that money to for people to become custodians of the biodiversity that they live with?
So one reason why we're talking about the biodiversity is that we have a Biodiversity Convention from '92. Lots of biologists and people that loves nature thinks that convention is about protection and conserving. Actually, conservation do not exist in that in the wording of it. It's actually a convention about. It has three components. It has, we should not cause other species to go extinct. So that's a moral, ethical thing. The other thing is about uses. It's about sustainable use. So it's not protection, it's sustainable use. And the third thing is equal sharing of cost and benefit at a global scale. Those are the three things that goes in there.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking also about what positive things are there in this case. Who can save us from the extinction? Who are the ones who will change the situation?
Everyone
we're
in the
sitting
room.
here. Humans are the cause. It is the way we act and the way we manage things. And right now it's not sustainable. And the only one that can change this is us.
Yeah.
And this is why we have international talks, international agreements. This is why EU is pushing. This is an agenda that is being pushed enormously. And there will be, just like we've seen the climate change being pushed as a global thing, this is the next big thing that will be pushed. Because we can change it, and I remain fairly optimistic that if we are willing to do it and if we understand it, we can change it before it goes wrong.
Yeah. No, I was present at the Biodiversity COP1 in Bahamas in, I think it was '94. And I remember one of the big discussions was the private enterprises, that they wanted not to pay for biodiversity, but that has changed.
Now, I mean, if you're looking at the big international companies in Denmark, they are talking about the United Nations sustainability targets, but the other things they're talking about trying to develop governance and other strategy for is biodiversity. So in many ways, the largest Danish companies is talking much more about this, about what to do it, than the public is. So I think actually a part of the solution is that private sector will push this in the right direction. They are doing that because they think this will be important for most people. So it makes economic sense for various reasons, but it's also because they expect that we will put pressure on it, and they're preparing for it, but they take it very, very seriously.
So it's not necessarily the governments, but also the private enterprises.
I think private enterprises are so important because, in fact, when in the UK anyway, 90% of the UK land is privately owned. So while you can have all the government policies about how to manage the land, you really do need to work with the people who are working that land and own the land and get them to understand the value of biodiversity to their business. Recently I was at a meeting with Mars, the people who make Mars bars. So Mars Inc., they used to have, biodiversity was a separate thing where they paid money into and called it corporate social responsibility. And then they realized that actually all that was happening, they were giving money for projects that were failing. So the economists said, right, let's take the biodiversity and let's put it on our main spreadsheet and see how much biodiversity we're using in the production of a sachet of coffee or a chocolate bar. And what they found when they started to look at the input of biodiversity, first of all, they found it was really important, but they also found the biggest use tended to be in the processing and the packaging. And so when they looked at that, they reduced the amount of biodiversity they were using in that. They made a bigger profit, and they had a bigger impact on biodiversity than than putting money separately into a corporate social responsibility fund. And so it was that joint bringing the biodiversity into the main part of their accounts that really starts to make the difference. And I think it's that approach. It's starting to see biodiversity is not as a luxury, but actually something that's absolutely essential to the business. And there are other examples, the clean Vittel and Perrier. You know, they want clean water, they need clean water, we want to have lovely spring water, but that clean water from the French Alps requires the soils not to be eroded. So again, it's maintaining the trees on those slopes in order to make sure your water is pure. So who maintains those trees? Well, it has to be the landowner. So therefore, it goes back to this saying, let's reward or pay money to the person who is the custodian of that biodiversity that we all rely upon.
I was thinking about also one of your expert areas as a researcher is also the climate change and what's happening to the environment at the global level, and there's also some global level change in the way plants behave. Yeah, so plants are flowering earlier. That's certainly, we're seeing a change in the flowering patterns. We're seeing novel assemblages, novel communities. Different things are growing alongside other things. We're seeing plants moving up mountains. We're seeing plants moving north into areas that didn't have plants before. But a really interesting one, as we're increasing the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide, plants are getting bigger. Tree trunks are getting thicker. And in savanna areas, you're finding there's a big increase, right around the edge of Africa, an increase in woody biomass as a result of the increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide. So on one side, you could say it's not all bad news, because actually you've got bigger plants, lusher, higher yields. But of course, that comes at a cost, because we're also totally changing the whole ecosystem, and they're draining more nutrients from the soil. So you will get to a point where the soils are no longer able to support the plants, and that will be catastrophic. But we are, from the beginning, talking about the 6 great mass extinctions of species on Earth. What is the forecast, really? I mean, we are in a bad situation now, but will it change? What's going to happen?
I think that we see a lot of movement on the global level and at the EU level that is making decisions on this. I sometimes get asked by a Danish journalist if I remain optimistic, and I say yes, but I remain optimistic because of these global talks. I do sense an understanding of the issues and the complexity, and also start seeing a willingness for politicians to make decisions. One of the things I'm often being told by politicians is that one of the problems is that when they get back home, they need to communicate with the public. And if you're making a huge decision that will change things, you need to have the understanding and the support of your voters. And if the British if the British thinks it's a washing thing, then it's hard to get support to it. There was a survey in Denmark about how many Danes that knew about the word biodiversity, and it's about 60%. That's the 3rd lowest in Europe. So Sweden and Germany is about 90%. Then they were really bold and asked the next question: do you have any idea about what it is? And for that, there was 20%. Now we don't know if they think it's a washing thing, but at least 20% thought they had something. And that's actually one of the big issues that I see actually a lot of willingness at an international EU global scale to make decisions to do this, but there's still a way to go to understand the seriousness in the public about it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that some people say is we should get rid of the word biodiversity altogether and just use the word nature. And on the surface, I think that's a good idea. You think, yeah, people immediately know what you talk about, nature. But there is a sort of a but in here. And if you think about nature and its role in sequestering carbon, drawing it down, locking it up in the wood, You only have to go to Brazil to see miles and miles of monodominant eucalyptus forest. That is nature sequestering the carbon. Now, is that good? No, absolutely not. And so therefore, nature is too broad a term. It's the diversity that we need, not just the single species. And I think that's the problem with the word nature. But if anyone has a better suggestion for another word to biodiversity, I think we'll be all ears, actually.
So I fully agree. In Denmark, we used to talk about, as we use a Danish term that's called environment. That's very broad. So when we do something good for climate, we also thought we did something good for nature and biodiversity and everything. Then we learned to say nature, and then we are working with this. So for example, I'm one of the persons that has done all the analysis about the necessity to do something with our forest, because basically our forests are dead. There's nothing in there. Just because they're green and we call them nature is not the same as they have biodiversity in there. So if I look at a cornfield or a Danish forest, they're basically equally dead in terms of having other organisms. So I think it is important to understand the word biodiversity and what that means. And sometimes I used to debate a lot with Ida Auken about these things, and she was arguing that we needed to call it nature because that was easy to understand. And my point was that, well, the rest of the world is talking about something else, and we need to talk about the same thing as the rest of the world. And we did some township meetings in Albania, Bolivia, Denmark, and China, and Vietnam, where we had the same material, where citizens in town hall meetings were talking. And I prepared the material and was watching it on live, and I said, that was impressive how much they understood and how much they made the discussion of this, except in Denmark. Because in Denmark, they ended up talking about hunting. So they kind of, missed the entire point. And my point to Ida Auken was that I don't think the Danes are more stupid than other people. So yes, we can also learn to talk about these things in the way that the rest of the world is talking.
I'll come back to you afterwards, but I was just thinking about what Kathy said about the biobanks. What about in the animal world? How effective are biobanks, or do we call them zoos, and can they conserve anything substantial?
That was what I pointed out. That was my first scientific paper to do an evaluation of that. No, they can't. But there is one route, and that is that's genomic and genetic material. Yep. So a lot of the value of biodiversity is in the genes and what they can do, and that we can preserve. And this is where, just like Kathy talks about the preservation of seed banks, that is what we are seeing. I come from the Natural History Museum of Denmark, and we used to have, or we have a lot of collections of dead animals and plants on herbariums. What we are building up is huge genetic deposit and materials. And those are going to be absolutely important for the future.
And that's also true with plants as well. I mean, the seed bank is a very, very expensive way of keeping something going. So at the same time, we have a freezer, which has got the DNA in, and that one freezer is the most biodiverse area in the world in terms of its genetic diversity.
But I can give you an example. We have done the entire mapping of the genes in most of the larger groups of birds, including chicken. There's 10,000 genes. What happens when we had a mass extinction, actually happens before the mass extinction, there was a lot of mutation in birds, and basically the immune defense broke down. And they were really not very good at killing off diseases, and birds was actually going down. Then we have the mass extinction, and suddenly there was a free world where they were adapted to flying around, and that benefited them. But basically, all bird lineages still have no immune system. One of the very old lineages of birds is chicken. We're taking the red wildfowl. It has no immune system. For some reason, we have picked the red jungle fowl and made that a chicken. Why are we doing that? Because it grows fast and lays a lot of eggs. Yeah. That is just to survive, because it cannot survive diseases. Yeah. So right now we have spread it all over the world. We're depending on it for food, but it has no immune defense. So we heard about avian flu and all those things. Everything, all diseases will jump on chicken. Now, there's lots of different chicken species out there.
Yeah.
There is a very high possibility that some of the other jungle fowls out there has an immune system, because we know that it's only the very oldest one that hasn't figured out to have an immune system. So most of the rest of the bird has an immune system. So that's, a good reason for preserved biodiversity.
You mentioned genetics sequencing. I was wondering, will we be able to sequence these animals or species and then conserve them as electronic sequences so we can regenerate them again at a later time?
You talk about regenerating genes or species?
I'm talking about the step.
So if you talk about genes,
yeah.
I'll say, yes, we have all the technology to do that. No problem. It's just a matter of cost. And the cost is going down and down and down and down. For us to do a sequence of an organism where we map out all the, for mammals or birds, map out 11,000 genes or 20,000 genes, takes about $2,000. That's what we can cost when we're operating in big machines. And it's easy to preserve. It is more costly for plants. They're much more complicated.
They have huge genomes. That's some of them that if you take out the genetic material in a single cell and spread it out, it would go to 30 meters in length. I mean, they're extraordinary, some of these plants. So it's a problem.
No, but I was also thinking, when you have these sequences and you have all this information, can you then create this extinct animal afterwards?
No, and I think we're far away from doing that. That's because there's other things than genes. It's enormously complex. So I'm not an expert in that, but if I talk to my colleagues, Tom Gilbert or Kathy Willis that is working with this, they'll say no way in hell. It's not going to happen. But I think that what we can do is the genes.
Yeah.
And that's actually where a lot of the value lies. And that is very, very easy. We have this technology, we can do it. We just involved in a major collaboration, also with some of Kathy's people, and that is to make some basic sequences of all the tree species in the Amazon. And it's about 16,000 species. And why is that interesting? That's interesting if we look at the chemical components that goes into the drugs that is used for chemotherapy for cancer, then 75% of all those drugs has components that comes from tree species in the Amazon. But we only mapped out about half of them. And this is also why there's a huge interest for medical industry, but this is again coming into the equal sharing of benefits for biodiversity in Brazil, where we're doing this. But we can do the genes, and this is where research is moving very, very rapidly because it has enormous potential and benefit.
Time is running very fast. We have 40 seconds left. One last question. Are you optimistic about the state of biodiversity in the future?
Yes, I think I am. I think we are now asking the right questions, and we're getting the right bodies behind the questions they're asking. And I do think the big businesses are joining in with this discussion. And given that most of the biodiversity loss is driven by land use change, that's where we need to be. So I am optimistic.
And you, Carsten?
I remain positive, but on condition that the public gets behind it.
Yeah.
And the public only gets behind it if we start understanding it.
Thank you very much, and a big hand to our two speakers.
Thank you.
That was brilliant.